I've got to read off Dr. Rory Reid's impressive bio here. So Dr. Reid holds a master's degree in social work and doctorate in clinical psychology with a development emphasis in neuropsychology and marriage and family therapy. He completed his APA postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Psychiatry at UCLA. He is currently assistant professor of psychiatry and a research psychologist in the Department of Psychiatry at UCLA. He mentors students, teachers, works with patients, and conducts research. He also works in the state of Nevada and working with patients in Las Vegas with coarse gambling disorder and other behavioral addictions. He has published numerous research articles on behavioral addictions in scientific journals and has worked clinically with hundreds of individuals, couples, and families. His work has been featured in press outlets such as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Time Magazine, as well as TV specials on ABC, CBS, and Fox News. He serves on the editorial boards for several peer-reviewed journals and has trained and educated mental health professionals, industry specialists, government organizations, and lay audiences around the world. Wow, that's a mouthful, Dr. Reid. We'd like to welcome you. And for those of you who've been through our 4-day core, if Dr. Reid looks familiar, he's on one of our videos with Dr. Michael Campos when we go over the UCLA handbooklet. I've heard Dr. Reid speak in San Diego. It was my last bit of business travel I had before COVID. He's a great speaker, so we look forward to hearing you today. Without further ado, I'll let you have it, Dr. Reid.
Thanks, Robbie. Thanks for organizing this. I know there's a lot of background stuff that happens in these things. So today we're going to jump in and talk about mindfulness applications for problem gambling. And one of the things that I would hope is throughout this training to be able to give you perhaps some tools or some ideas about how you can, engender this within patients and helping them to kind of adopt the mindfulness perspective with a number of different things that we'll talk about. Jumping in, I don't have any conflicts of interest across any categories of potential conflicts of interest with this presentation. And so as we talk about mindfulness, I suspect the vast majority of people that are listening to this have had exposure to mindfulness in some sort or another. And so some of the 101 stuff that we might normally do in a very rudimentary beginning course, even like, for example, with a patient, I'm not going to kind of go over that as much today as I'm going to go over kind of maybe ways to help you disseminate mindfulness teachings, philosophies, and concepts for patients. And again, I'm going to make this slideshow available to Robbie after the fact. We've gotten in this business of just asking people, hey, can I have a copy of your slideshow? And some people put like as much work into a slideshow as they do a book, and we would never go and say, hey, can I get a copy of your book? That being said, I also realize the vast majority of people are visual learners, and without that, it's difficult. So I'm going to make this available. My only ask is that you keep this to yourselves, and that you don't just give this to anybody who wasn't part of this presentation. And part of the rationale for that is that because I just don't want things to be taken out of context. So I'm happy to give you this material, and I'm going to create a Dropbox link that Robbie can send out afterwards with some of the videos and other things I'm going to be sharing today. So mindfulness is kind of based on a lot of Eastern philosophy, and it can be difficult for problem gamblers, many who've been raised with philosophies more consistent with Western culture, to kind of get it. And I always start with this in my office. I've got a big screen TV, and I can project things from my laptop. And I'll start with this picture, and I'll say to them, can you find the hidden tiger? In this picture of a hidden tiger, there is a hidden tiger. Find the hidden tiger. And I'm going to, for the sake of time, I don't want to just, sit here with silence, but some of you may be able to find it. The vast majority of people struggle through this. And to help you out, I'm priming you a little bit in the sense that I'm showing you a picture of a hidden tiger, which kind of biases your attention to look for a pictorial representation of a hidden tiger, when in fact it is a textual representation. THEHIDDENTIGERS. So it's in the stripes, right? And part of the reason I start with patients to kind of show them this is because, as I said earlier, mindfulness is often like an Eastern philosophical kind of paradigm, and they have to shift. And so sometimes patients will say, well, I don't understand how this relates, or I don't get this. And I'll say, hey, remember the hidden tiger? Keep looking for a hidden tiger. There could be things that are right in front of you, but you're missing just because of the way that you're looking at it. And I think mindfulness can help expand our ability to think outside the box and be more cognitively flexible. I also share this little clip of Karate Kid. Do you remember in Karate Kid, the wax on, wax off? Daniel-san, he's been really frustrated because Mr. Miyagi's been having him, sand the deck and wash, paint the fence and all of that. And he's like, well, what is this? He gets really upset. He's like, well, what does this have to do? I'm here to learn karate. And then there's this epic moment where he brings it together and he's like, ah. So let me show you this. And again, I play this for patients too.
Sand floor. Big circle. Sand floor. Sand floor. Now show me wax on, wax off. Hey.
Wax on, wax off.
Wax on, wax off. Hey, wax on, hot. Wax off. Concentrate. Look at my eye. Lock a hand. Thumb inside. Wax on, hot. Wax off. Hot. Wax on, hot. Wax off. Hot. Wax on. Wax off. Show me paint the fence. Up, down. Up, down. Up, down. Other side. Look, eye. Always look, eye. Show me paint the house. Side, side. Back wrist. Side, side. Side, side. Yes. Show me wax on, wax off. Cat! 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 Show me paint the fence. Cat! Face! Cat! Cat! Show me side to side. Yes! 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 Show me sand floor. Cat! Face! 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 Stop! Stop! Look, always look,
So I'm not sure how many of you remember that movie, but there's that epic moment where he realizes, initially though, he doesn't have that connection. Like, what does all this have to do with learning karate? And then all of a sudden it all comes together in this moment. And I share this video with patients and kind of help them understand, listen, there's going to be some things that you're going to do with mindfulness that maybe you won't see how it generalizes, but you've got to be patient with the process and realize that in time it will come together for you. So that's one of the things I do psychoeducationally with patients. I want to show you also kind of a lot of the ways in which I think it can generalize. So for example, this idea of shame, and a lot of gamblers struggle with issues with shame. And in mindfulness, we have self-compassion. We have boredom proneness in gamblers, and there's awareness and a couple of other things that help people increase their tolerance for boredom. There's the stress proneness element, letting go of the stories that give rise to stress proneness. We'll talk about that later. Impulsivity, noticing, curiosity, and we'll talk more about that as well. There's this attitude with a lot of problem gamblers of just entitlement, lack of gratitude, and in mindfulness, they cultivate gratitude and humility. There's this emotional reactivity in a lot of problem gamblers. There's lots of research supporting that. And in mindfulness, we're helping them learn how to be emotionally present, curious, this intolerance for any kind of discomfort. And again, part of mindfulness is reorganizing the relationship with suffering. Critical, judgmental, compared to openness and non-judgmentalness. Rumination and obsessive, preoccupative types of thoughts get turned into reflection in mindfulness. A lot of anxiety and depression. Think about anxiety. Anxiety is about your mind wandering to the future and anticipating things that could go wrong, where depression is your mind wandering back to the past and thinking about things that happened and ruminating about what you could have done differently. And in mindfulness, it's not about being in the past or in the present or in the future. It's about being in the present and learning to let go of those wandering thoughts. There's a tug of war with craving, and in mindfulness, we're helping them reorganize that relationship in non-judgmental, accepting ways. The special status of thoughts compared to a thought is just a thought, and again, the letting go. The thought suppression and the compartmentalizing and gambling, as opposed to this openness and learning how to integrate and be more whole with the mindfulness. And then this disconnecting, the inattentive disassociation that happens with problem gamblers, opposed to being more attentive and present. And these are just a handful of the things that we see kind of correlate with why mindfulness might be a good fit. So mindfulness is a philosophy. It's this practice of cultivating increased awareness to our moment-to-moment experiences in a non-judgmental way. And it's also a practice, right? So I tell patients it's a philosophy and it's a practice. And it originated in a lot of the Eastern philosophies with Buddhism. It was more medicalized by Jon Kabat-Zinn, and it's been applied to a lot of psychological and medical issues with a lot of research supporting its effectiveness. So the two component definition of mindfulness that I suggest that we consider was kind of developed a number of years ago in a conference where they kind of had a meeting of the minds. And one was that mindfulness kind of helps facilitate better attention by helping learn how to self-regulate attention, and particularly so it's maintained on the immediate experience, and that allows for this increased recognition of mental events. The second thing is an attitude, this openness, curiosity, and acceptance of whatever happens in one's moment and in the experience. And so those are kind of the two components of mindfulness in terms of predominantly kind of what it consists of. Now, one of the things I also try to help patients understand is what mindfulness is and what it's not. A lot of times, mindfulness we cultivate through meditation kind of experiences and practices. And don't get confused because a lot of patients will say, oh yeah, mindfulness is meditation. And that's like saying a road trip is part of a vacation is synonymous with just traveling in a car. While the car is the vehicle through which one is able to visit various destinations that contribute to your overall experience, we would be amiss to limit the description of a vacation to simply just riding in a car. And in fact, indeed, anybody who's been on a road trip knows there's just those 1,000 small moments, those breathtaking moments where we experience majestic views. And similarly, meditation is the vehicle to cultivating this wide array of mindful moments, experiences, and increased levels of awareness. So I try not to allow my patients to say, oh, mindfulness is synonymous with meditation. It's a mechanism to become mindful, but meditation of itself is not. So as we look at this, it's cultivated through meditation practices often that regulate attention and help them reorganize their experience with these various moments that they have, and leading to the increased insight and awareness. And a lot of times early on, patients will say, oh, this was really hard. My mind wandered a lot. I got distracted. And I often make this analogy of a gym. You went to a gym and you couldn't, your biceps weren't very strong. How would you strengthen them? By straining them, stressing them, stretching them, you would strengthen them. And in the same way, they're gonna do that through practicing mindfulness. It's going to create that mental stress of the brain and having to focus and concentrate. And that's hard for them. But I often encourage them to kind of be in search for those hidden tiger experiences. So let's talk about the mechanisms of action. How does mindfulness exert an effect? And this is something I love, and I try to simplify it for my patients, but I really want them to understand that this is how mindfulness is going to help. One, it's going to increase tolerance for the uncomfortable feelings because they're going to learn to be present with those, to be curious, non-judgmental, of those experiences. It's going to help enhance stress coping, and that's learning to let go of all the stories that give rise to stress. And they're going to also learn how to regulate the breathing, which also helps reduce stress. And as we know, stress is often a precipitating risk factor for gambling behaviors. They're going to reorganize their relationship with cravings. They're going to let go of the thoughts about cravings, being present in the body, and, being curious about how they experience their cravings, and being open and non-judgmental. They're also going to learn how to regulate their attention by sustaining focus on whatever's happening in the moment and letting go of the distracting thoughts and refocusing attention again and again and again. And we'll talk about why that becomes more important in a minute. And then reducing impulsivity and helping people kind of be present with the space. And we'll talk about that space shortly as well. And increasing their levels of self-control and reducing the effect of emotional dysregulation on impulsive responses. So we've done some research over the years on mindfulness. I've done it with both compulsive sexual behavior and also with problem gambling. And we do see these relationships between lower levels of mindfulness, emotion regulation, stress coping, and impulse control compared to patients who are non-gambling disordered. And so overall, not surprising, gambling severity was negatively associated with higher levels of mindfulness and positively linked to these emotional dysregulation, stress, proneness, and impulsivity. So the correlations between mindfulness, interestingly enough, and emotional dysregulation, they're much stronger than those between mindfulness and the severity of gambling disorder. And what that suggests is that there might be a mediating relationship here where by cultivating mindfulness, it helps reduce some of these other variables and thereby, by extension, helps reduce gambling behaviors. So let's start with this first one. And by the way, if you have questions, feel free to text them in the chat box. I've got that up on my dual monitors here as well. So let's talk about this first mechanism of increasing tolerance for uncomfortable feelings. So a lot of patients essentially dichotomize emotions as either all good and all bad. And we kind of arbitrarily have this, this line where we just kind of divide. And what patients with problem gambling and other kinds of addictions try to do is they have this belief about the awkward, uncomfortable, bad, unpleasant emotions that somehow those are bad. So guess what? We've got to disconnect from them. And people do that through all sorts of ways, as noted here on the slide, turning to porn, gambling, sex, food, drugs, alcohol, all these things that kind of activate dopaminergic pathways in the striatum and these other areas where they're able to have that mood-altering experience and disconnect. And so they assume, hey, I've avoided all of these uncomfortable, unpleasant mood states. But really what happens is that arbitrary line shifts. And now what happens is they go from having this bandwidth of positive emotions and having it be reduced. And that's why a lot of people with addictions ultimately start to become kind of emotionally avoidant, and they become numb and detached from both good and bad feelings. They're narrowing that bandwidth of affective experiences. And this makes sense too. If you think about it, how do we appreciate a rainy day? Well, it's because we live through a sunny day. And it's these contrasts in our life that help us appreciate things. And so if they're constantly avoiding the uncomfortable experiences, it really limits how much they can appreciate the positive experiences in their life. And so part of mindfulness is helping them lean into those uncomfortable experiences and giving themselves that experience that says, I can survive the discomfort of whatever experiences that I'm trying to avoid. And so we've seen this too, right? Where people have these unpleasant affective states, they want to avoid, disassociate, and then they turn to gambling to soothe and tranquilize that. But then it just creates further additional shame, anxiety, and so forth. And it becomes this kind of downward spiral. It's like the man on fire who jumps into a lake and then he begins to drown. He doesn't really solve the original problem. Also, we have looked at research and relationships here with a lot of these variables with anxiety, depression, stress proneness, impulsivity. And what we find is that there are these intercorrelations between them but they also are all directly correlated with problem gambling. And what mindfulness does is mindfulness exerts its effect through these various uncomfortable affective states, and by extension then reduces the tendency towards problem gambling. And then there's a certain amount of variance that's directly correlated that we haven't figured out yet, and those are research projects that are still in process. So a second mechanism of action is that mindfulness exerts an effect on problem gambling by helping with stress. So as most of us know, there's this circularity. In the DSM-5, we have these persistent and reoccurring problematic gambling behaviors that lead to clinically significant impairment or distress, but then they often gamble when feeling distressed. So stress becomes both a precipitating risk factor and a perpetuating risk factor for problem gambling. Now, there are models of stress, such as this idea that basically our demands exceed our resources, and people have this appraisal, and if they say, yeah, I have the necessary resources to meet my demands, then they have these adaptive coping abilities. But if not, then it's a maladaptive coping ability, and that itself creates additional demands. And so what we're doing here is, with mindfulness, we're kind of helping them, all of the, in this appraisal, right? There's this appraisal of my resources and demands that have all the judging thoughts, jumping to conclusions, assumptions, catastrophizing, all the stories that we make up. Well, in mindfulness, we're learning how, like, a thought is just a thought, not just a fact because we think it's true. They're learning how to let go of those mind-wandering types of thoughts and the stories that exacerbate any kind of potential stressful experience. I also have my patients watch the TED Talk by Dr. Kelly McGonigal about reframing stress and making stress your friend. There's some good principles in there. And so we also know that just even through the breathing exercises that are inherent in mindfulness, that people learn how to regulate their breathing, and then that thereby reduces their respiratory functions, and by extension reduces stress. You cannot have having respirations like 28 respirations a minute and be I should say having respirations like 12 respirations a minute and have that be conducive with a stressful state. They're incompatible. I also sometimes, just by way of, I sometimes will use things like the little stress eraser, where patients, to help them learn how to breathe, they can put their finger in there. There's the LCD or LED printout where it shows how they're getting proper breathing to help them kind of realize how to breathe. Now, in mindfulness, we're often not trying to get them to change their breathing. We're just getting to try to observe it. But there does come a point where the regulation of the breathing does become part of the practice as they notice irregular breathing patterns and so forth. They correlate that with the distress, and then they're able to modify some of that. Another mechanism of action in mindfulness is reorganizing the relationship with cravings and letting go of thoughts about cravings. And again, a lot of times people have these negative beliefs about cravings, that cravings are the enemy, they're these bad things. And in fact, it's their beliefs about cravings that are really what is the problem. And in mindfulness, we're learning how to let go of those beliefs and just experience the craving in an open, non-judgmental way. Now, reorganizing with cravings can be hard and difficult, and for a number of different reasons. I'm going to pick one little thing just for example. For example, think about the cravings that we have with food, and all of the cultural messages around food. And I'm going to show this little advertisement audio to illustrate this this mentality of eat now. We're open 24 hours a day. If you have a craving, satisfy it. Do it now. And let's listen to this real quick.
Whoa, hello, Jonathan. It is I, your craving. It's like 3 in the morning. I wasn't expecting you. I could tell. Your place is a disaster. Well, it's funny you're here. I could really go for 2 all-beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun. Yeah, how did you... I'm your craving, Jonathan. Let us get a Big Mac at McDonald's. Don't worry, I DVR the game.
Crave as late as you want. Many McDonald's drive-thrus are now open 24 hours.
So when we initially hear that, you know, we kind of are amused. It sounds funny and whatnot. But think about it, like it's early hours of the morning, like you should be sleeping, not having a Big Mac meal, and of course supersize it and all the rest of that. I mean, it really is kind of on demand. If you have the cravings, satisfy it now, and that's just an overall. If you want something, buy it now. Even if you don't have the money, put it on credit. That's kind of this cultural messages that are often inherent. And so we've got to, not only are we fighting their cravings with with problem gambling, but we're also kind of this larger cultural message of just having awareness of cravings across multiple domains. Interestingly, in a study of this in Appetite, in the journal Appetite, where they've helped them cultivate mindfulness as an intervention, uh, the authors report acceptance. In other words, we just accept that craving. It was found to reduce the extent to which participants experience this loss of control when exposed to food cues. This finding, they said, was not only particularly relevant, but interestingly from a theoretical point of view as well. After all, acceptance requires one not to control the cravings, and that paradoxically leads to higher levels of perceived control. And in fact, a lot of problem gamblers will say, you know, the moment I let go of this need to control the craving is actually the moment when I start to actually feel most empowered. Also, I'm going to share this little video with one of my colleagues from Yale, Dr. Hetty Kober, who talks a little about that ebb and flow to cravings. She also gave a TED talk, and again, the links will be in the PowerPoint.
Mindfulness can be thought of as a non-judgmental attention to one's moment-to-moment experience, or kind of an accepting attitude towards whatever arises in the experience. And in the last 20 years, there's actually been quite a lot of research on mindfulness showing that it's effective for anything from stress through depression, anxiety, and chronic pain. In the last few years, some research was done that suggests that mindfulness training or different forms of mindfulness training are effective for substance use disorders, are effective for hypersexual behavior, and effective for pathological gambling. And one idea is that the reason why it's effective is because it teaches people a new way to interact with their craving, or a new way to interact with their compulsive urges. And one way that mindfulness training might do that is by teaching people to, first of all, notice when craving arises, kind of notice what's happening in the body, notice what it feels like, and just have the awareness to know that it's there, coupled with this feeling of acceptance. It's okay that the craving is here, without pushing it away, without wanting it to go away, just saying, oh, craving is here, and it's okay. And that's also often accompanied by a teaching that craving is kind of like all mental events. It comes and goes. It has kind of an ebb and flow of its own. And therefore, if a drug user, for example, can learn to recognize the craving, accept that it's there, and then notice as it maybe gets more and more intense, reaches its peak, and then goes away, perhaps even using a technique we call noting while that's happening. And it might be something as general as saying, oh, I'm feeling craving, I'm still feeling craving, or getting even more granular, more small in what you might notice. So for example, tightening in the stomach, oh, it's getting tighter, maybe tightening in the chest, sweaty palms. Oh, okay, now it's relieving, and now it's falling away.
So that just kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of kind of the mindfulness philosophy and how we cope with craving. By the way, I'll make these videos available to you as well, so you can share them with your patients to the extent that you find them helpful. So, you know, one of the things that with cravings is that, first of all, they can be very powerful and intense. And, you know, our patients get into a tug of war with these cravings, and they give special status to them, right? And because of that, it creates this adversarial relationship, you know. But what people don't realize is that my cravings are 2 steps removed from the consequences. The consequences of acting on those cravings are problematic. They are uncomfortable, and we know that they cause a lot of havoc in our patients' lives. What we're trying to say is, can you just sit with the craving? Can you co-create a little bit of a space here that says, hey, this craving can sit with me, I can sit with the craving, and I don't have to get into a slay the dragon mentality and just notice what I'm feeling and how somatically I experience that craving. And people think, well, if I do that, then I'm going to act out on it. But remember, if you start to think about what it would be like to act on the craving, then your mind has just wandered to the future. Or if you're having euphoric recall about last time you acted on the craving, your mind has just wandered to the past. It really is helping them kind of sit with and be present with that experience in the moment, moment by moment. And in this way, they're reorganizing the relationship with the craving. And they're neither avoiding the craving or indulging it. They're just sitting and observing it in a very non-judgmental kind of a manner. And there's certainly been a lot of research out there to suggest that helping patients with a mindfulness approach to craving can enhance their ability to be present with that craving without reacting to it, and thereby reducing the problematic behavior, whether it's gambling, whether it's sex, sexual addiction, whether it's smoking cessation, drug and alcohol, and so forth. All right, so let's move on to this next way that mindfulness exerts its effect. And again, I want my patients to know that this is how mindfulness is going to help you. And as you practice mindfulness, kind of that wax on, wax off moment, can you be thoughtful and look for the hidden tigers in these various facets? Enhancing the ability to regulate attention. So it's helping them learn how to sustain their focus on whatever's going on in the moment and letting go of all the distracting thoughts and refocusing their attention again and again and again. And there's been a lot of research on mindfulness and attentional things, especially there's been several different studies on ADHD and showing that it's effective with that population. And we also know that about 25% of problem gamblers also have ADHD with inattentive subtype. So think about, have you ever thought about like problem gambling as kind of an attentional problem? So in other words, people have an inability to sustain attention on some kind of a target stimuli. And often that stimuli is, it can be boring, mundane, routine, kind of like work. I'm supposed to be focused on work. And they're not able to sustain their attention on that, nor are they able to inhibit their attention from whatever the distraction is. And in this case, maybe it's thoughts about gambling, right? And so what we're saying here is that in an attentive condition, and the idea is if you can enhance your ability to regulate your attention, you would be able to have more time in your life in an attentive condition. But in an attentive condition, I'm able to sustain my attention on the target, whatever it is that I'm trying to focus on, for example, work. And I'm able to inhibit attention from being distracted. But in the inattentive condition, that the opposite occurs, right? And so remember, part of mindfulness is self-regulating attention, so it's maintained on that experience and allowing their, the increased recognition of the things that are happening in that moment. And again, that's why we have them focus on something like the breathing. Anchor your attention in your breathing. Your breathing's boring, it's mundane, it's routine. But if you can sustain your attention on that, and then you notice, oh, my mind's wandered. Oh, okay. Notice where it's wandered, let go, and then refocus your attention. And by practicing that again and again and again, the way it generalizes, the wax on, wax off moment is that if I'm in this situation where I start to have intrusive thoughts about gambling, I can refocus my attention on whatever it is going on and let go of the mind wandering to those gambling thoughts. And if I have to let go of wandering thoughts if I'm focusing on my breathing, for example, let's say I end up doing that 50 or 100 times in 10 minutes, right? Imagine how that when they're sitting there and they have that craving to gamble, the thought of gambling. Most patients, oh, I tried to fight it. Really? Well, how many times? Oh, I did several times. Several meaning 2 or 3, and then you just went and gambled because that's what you wanted to do. As opposed to like, well, hey, you know what? Here comes a thought about gambling. Oh, I can note it, let it go, refocus, let it go, and they can sit with that. Oh, if that gambling thought comes back 100 times, I can let it go 100 times and refocus my attention on my work or whatever else. And because I've practiced doing this with my breathing in mindfulness, right? And so the so what is that it can help them focus their attention, and we know that it does that, and therefore increases their ability to cope with the gambling behaviors. And in essence, if you think about this, with mindfulness, okay? They're decreasing how much mind wandering happens. They're decreasing the time to when they notice their mind has wandered. They're decreasing how much time it is to let go of that thought, and they're decreasing how much time it would be to refocus their attention. These are all skill sets that are being practiced in mindfulness. And so collectively, the time spent being inattentive before mindfulness and after mindfulness is reduced. And that helps them learn, again, to increase that level of attention. So the fourth thing is reducing impulsivity. And through helping people be present with the space and increasing the levels of self-control and reducing their affect dysregulation. So I'm not going to go into these slides. I'm going to let you read on your own for the sake of time. Most of us know about these different ways in the research that mindfulness has been measured. And these definitions, again, will be on the slides for you. But we've seen that these clinical levels of impulsivity, this was a study that we did a few years back, where about half of patients, whether they were gamblers, compulsive sexual behavior, or in this case, the substance use disorder with meth abuse, meth dependence, about half across the board had clinical levels of impulsivity. That tells us that, one, this is a heterogeneous population, so don't assume that all gamblers are impulsive. However, it seems like at least a half of them are. And one of the ways that mindfulness can exert an effect, this was a study that was interestingly done, taking a look at how neuroticism exerts an effect on impulsivity through mindfulness. So mindfulness reduces that emotionally dysregulated state, and thereby people are less impulsive. And in like manner, it increases self-control in a similar fashion. So this is a quote that I often will share with my patient. Between the stimulus and the response, there is a space that is a space, and in that space is our power to choose our response, and in our response lies our growth and freedom. Now, some of you may be surprised to see that I'm attributing this to actually Dr. Rollo May, because some of you have heard, and it's actually all over the internet. If you search this quote, you're going to find it with Viktor Frankl. But in fact, that's not the origin of this particular quote. And I can give the sources on that if anybody wants to know, but this is the correct source for this quote. And he was a psychologist and talked about these principles. And so what mindfulness is really doing is it's helping people. The stimulus might be that craving or that urge, and the response is acting on it. But in between that is this space, and mindfulness helps increase their ability to be present with that space, because they notice that they're more aware. And as a result, by being in that space, they're able to make better choices. And that is where they learn to grow, and the freedom to make a healthier choice comes from. So again, it helps them pause, slow down, and notice before they just impulsively react to various things that might be going on. And again, there's research to support that in fact actually happens. So summary review here is that mindfulness increases tolerance for uncomfortable feelings. And there's a number of ways that it does that. It helps with stress coping. And there's a number of ways that it does that. We're helping them through cultivating mindfulness to reorganize relationships with cravings, letting go of thoughts about cravings, being present in the body, curious about cravings, and so forth. We're also helping increase their ability to regulate their attention. And we've talked about how, those two mechanisms in attention that are compromised, my inability to sustain attention and my inability to inhibit my attention from a distractor, we're helping enhance those attentional networks in the brain. And in fact, neuroimaging studies actually also support that happens as well. And finally, we're learning how to reduce impulsivity. So again, for the sake of time, I'm going to mention these videos, but I'm not going to play them all the way through, just because I want to just capture. I think it's going to be at the expense of maybe some other content that we could cover. But the point here is, remember A Beautiful Mind, and that point in A Beautiful Mind where he's out in the courtyard.
The world will burn to ashes. You are not real. You are not real. Most soldiers are
So most of you have seen Beautiful Mind. That was just a few little snippets. But he's in that place where he's just really dysregulated with his hallucination of the man with the black hat, right? And once he learned how to kind of create that space with his hallucinations where he could just be present with them and say, oh, there it is. I don't need to indulge it. I don't need to ignore it. I can just coexist in this space. Those hallucinations lost their power to send them into this spiral. And so again, I share these videos with patients to help them kind of capture the spirit of mindfulness. Cool.
Thank you so much.
And there's his hallucinations. And so again, some of these videos just help patients kind of capture that, like, hey, you get into this tug of war with your cravings and you're completely out of control, you're dysregulated. But if you can learn how to just create that space where they can coexist with you, then you're going to find yourself in a situation where you're significantly less reactive to them. So I also want to mention a couple of resources here, and then I'm going to just maybe finish up with a few additional thoughts, because sometimes we don't get to all the resources. I mentioned a couple of different scripts, and I meant to say audio files that you can access that can help with this. And on our UCLA Mindfulness Awareness Research Center website, there are some things here that will, links, I should say, to these free guided meditations. If you come in here, you come into guided meditations, and then you come down here, you can see there's several, a lot more than 3. One is just a typical breathing meditation. Others are learning meditation to work through difficult emotions, right? And helping them cultivate that ability. A loving kindness meditation for shame, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So some of these different audio files to help them. Some people like the guided meditations. Other people prefer to actually just not do those. And so I always just try to honor whatever might work for patients, and I let them, have the opportunity to experiment with both. I also wrote an article on mindfulness and gambling addictions for ProTalk, and I'll create that. I'll give you that article in the Dropbox link that I'm going to send you as well. So again, I wasn't sure for our time. I've got a few additional thoughts that I want to share. So first of all, there are some different books and materials, and this again will be in the slideshow that you will be able to access. And I wanted to share that with you. These are some books: Mindfulness-Based Relapse Prevention for Addictions. There's some good things there in terms of resources that you can access. And this is one of my colleagues at UCLA, Fully Present. That's a really good book for accessing. Clinician's Guide to Teaching Mindfulness. And this one I really love for patients as well, this Mindfulness in Plain English. So there's some resources. Let's kind of move on. I want to talk about shame for just a minute. And shame is just really this self-critical affective experience that often will send patients into a spiral when it comes to their addictive behaviors. And again, for the sake of time, I am going to put this video in the Dropbox. And this is one of Dr. Kristen Neff. Her and I were speaking at a conference in San Diego a couple years ago. I said, hey, I want to do a little video. And she's like, cool. So we created this video where she talked about a couple of videos. One was on, like, what is self-compassion? And then the second video is about how to cultivate self-compassion with respect to shame that debilitates people and often leads to their addictive behaviors. And so she goes through and she'll talk about some of these different facets of kindness, self-compassion. And what we've seen in our data is that shame and rumination have this bidirectional relationship, and they both are positively correlated with problem gambling. And by cultivating self-compassion, through self-compassion, it mediates the effects on problem gambling from shame and rumination. And so we know that it can be helpful as well. we've also, through neuroimaging and other kinds of studies, EEG studies, we've seen that there are these distinct processes of mindfulness, right? Where people, were able to delineate the phase where people's mind actually starts to wander, and that's a distinct phase. And then we notice that, like, okay, I let go of the wandering, and there's an actual specific distinct brain regions that are recruited in letting go. And then there's this idea of refocusing my attention. That's a different set of networks and cortical processes in the brain. And then again, this idea that through these processes and mindfulness, we're kind of cultivating, strengthening these various parts of the brain. And there's been studies on this too, where we've seen, in fact, one study looked at increased gray matter. And gray matter is the matter that matters. That's where our neurons actually reside. And so whenever someone's able to increase gray matter density, that means they've got more firepower, if you will, for various cortical processes, cognitive processes in the brain, which is kind of quite interesting. We're not quite sure how that happens. It could be neurogenesis. Some neurons in the brain can be reprogrammed. So, just as an analogy, you're a dishwasher. Oh, now I need you to be a server. You're a server. Now I need you to be the chef. You're the chef. Now I need you to be the host. And so sometimes with this neuronal reprogramming, that can also increase gray matter density as well. And along with the idea that neurons that fire together wire together, and that could also be responsible. But the overall effect is that, like, they've got more firepower, and mindfulness exerts that effect by increasing gray matter density. Again, let's think about our biceps. You get stronger biceps by stretching and strengthening them and stressing them. Similarly, when we do the mindfulness exercises in the brain, the same things are happening. So I want to just say something real quick about the unwanted thoughts that often are intrusive thoughts. And Dr. Daniel Wagner from Harvard actually had some interesting thoughts there, where he talked about this idea that, trying not to think about it. Remember the old white elephant, don't think about a pink elephant or whatever, in some funny way is just what makes such thoughts happen. Now, again, you guys can read this quote. I don't need to go through and read all these quotes, but in order to think about this, in order to not think about something, you have to know what it is you're not supposed to be thinking about, and therefore you have to think about it. So even the strategy is kind of fraught with some logical flaws that are going to inhibit your ability to do this. But what we know is that when people learn how to kind of just be present with these sorts of things and not say, oh, I've got to get rid of this thought, then the thoughts paradoxically kind of dissipate. So in mindfulness, we're making an effort for sustained attention. We're addressing the mind wandering. We're noticing where the mind's wandered, letting go of the tangential thoughts, and then helping them learn how to refocus their attention. So those are some of just the overall concepts of mindfulness, how they can apply to problem gambling. But I could go on for quite a bit longer, but I think the most important thing is to give you an idea of maybe some ways to teach our patients mindfulness and some ways to help them kind of buy into the mindfulness. But also the idea here is that we want to, through these mechanisms of action that are correlated with a lot of the issues with problem gambling, we're able to help them reduce the problem gambling through these various things that we've talked about. And so I do some psychoeducation around this, and then exercises around this in my office when I work with problem gamblers. And again, I'm not going to get into all of those exercises per se, because I suspect most people out here have exposure to those, access to those. I've given you some resources with the UCLA website and some of the book references where you can find a whole plethora of those exercises. But this is kind of helping you understand how it translates to reducing problem gambling behavior. So with that, Robbie, I'm open to questions. If people want to text them or whatnot, I'm happy to take those questions.
Sure. Hey, everybody. Great presentation. Thank you, Dr. Reid. What questions do you guys have? It looks like we've got 63 participants on, which is great today. But what questions do you have while we have Dr. Reid available at our hands here for the next 5 or 6 minutes, if you have questions? I will say while we're waiting, I really liked how you clarified the benefits of mindfulness. You know, Dr. Reid, I mean, it's kind of like, well, here's a tool, but I like how you lay out to your patients, this is what this hammer is going to do for you, or this tool will do for you. That kind of clarifies and makes that connection.
Yeah, I think a lot of mindfulness is hard for a lot of people when they first start out, and for most patients, they're, again, remember, part of the reason that our patients have gambling problems is because they're used to taking a lot of shortcuts in their life, right?
Right.
And so I think a lot of them really need to kind of understand, like, well, again, that wax on, wax off thing, like, how does this
Yes.
translate?
Right.
How is this gonna? I'm focusing on my breath. What does this have to do with problem gambling?
Right.
Like they don't make those connections. So I think helping them understand the wax on, wax off stuff helps them increase their motivation and commitment to mindfulness practices.
Yep, I really like that. I connected to that as a clinical social worker. So I like that. So, any
Do most people
questions?
know how to use? Do most people know how to use the chat box? Oh, they're mentioning.
Here we are.
Somebody,
Yeah.
somebody mentioned that.
So Bridget, we didn't get to the poll questions today, so you guys got lucky. You got out of poll questions today. So if you've got questions for Dr. Reid while we've got him here the next couple of minutes, we do have there's a compliment for you. Learn new things. Thank you.
How many of you are just Zoom fatigued? We're doing a lot of these.
I don't want to raise my hand. You know, I can.
We're doing so many of these with our patients, and
Yeah.
and then on top of that, like for those of us that teach, you know, there's yeah, it's tricky. These students in the fall, I don't know how they're going to handle.
Everybody's commenting. They're agreeing with you, Dr. Reid. I do too. Now, while I got you, I'm going to say too, I liked your analogy that you place the car travel within the vacation. That's a great way, I think, to lay out to our clients, patients, and folks. And I also liked how you laid out the uncomfortable experiences and how you explain that to patients that, hey, you know, what I've experienced in my work is, you know, a lot of people who are addicted to anything want to feel good all the time. You know, if that's the way life, I believe, in my opinion, is not supposed to happen that way. So it was nice how you laid out that the contrast can bring different things in your life and feelings in your life. We got a couple of different chats while we were talking here. And Bridget agrees with me. She likes the metaphors that you made during the presentation.
Yeah, and you know, these are my metaphors that I use. You may find ones that are more helpful or beneficial. Again, I just, a lot of patients, they struggle with just buying into this because it's so foreign to them. And then all of a sudden, you know, and even like, for example, boredom proneness. Like if someone tells me they're bored, remember our parents when we were growing up, we complained about being bored. Mom or dad would be like, well, I'll find something for you to do. And we know that meant chores. So we figured out something else.
Yeah.
And whatnot. The other thing, somebody's commenting, triggers last about 3 minutes. There's actually some differences on this in terms of the cravings, yes, but also there's some research just about emotional reactivity and the initial emotional discomfort. We've done EEG studies. It lasts about 90 seconds. But what happens is we make up stories about that emotional experience, and we can drag it out for, you know, 20 minutes, 40 minutes, days, really, when people ruminate that. And so this kind of comes back to that old adage, you know, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. And suffering often arises in the stories that we make up about our pain. And so in mindfulness, we're helping them just kind of sit with the pain and let go of all the stories that they make up about that pain so that they don't have to have that suffering, that then they're seeking some relief from that suffering through gambling or whatever else.
Right. Well, very good. Dr. Reid, we'd like to thank you again. We're coming right up on the hour. The next time you're going to see Dr. Reid is June 15th, 2021. So you had your chance to ask some questions. But we do want to thank you, and we do want to remind everybody, August 11th, we're going to have Dr. John Grant talk on evidence-based treatment of gambling. We hope everybody has a great weekend. And again, Dr. Reid, thank you. Great presentation, sir.
Thank you.
All
Thank
right,
you. And
everybody.
I'll create a Dropbox link and send you the materials, and you can email it out to everybody.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Everybody have a great weekend.
Thank you.
See
Bye-bye.
you. Thanks.